Thank you very much for this great opportunity to present some research we have. Wei said earlier that after seeing 3 industry presentations, the academic papers are relatively dry, right? So you better get a bottle of water ready because I'm going to present something that is academic paper but also theory paper. It's going to be even more dry than the previous 2. Yeah, so my time is a little limited, but I do want to mention that this is joint work with Jian Sun, who is at Singapore Management University. I think this is going to be a somewhat timely topic because there has been a lot of discussions about digital assets, in particular data, and the valuation of data. And we're going to think about, in particular, what is the consequence of data and particular information being manipulable, having to do with pricing, having to do with algorithms redesign, and so on and so forth. Okay? So hopefully that will be somewhat interesting. All right, so I'll give you a somewhat kind of flashy introduction or motivation first. On this slide here, you're seeing the kind of a poster child usage of alternative data for various kind of purposes. On the left, we know that a lot of the hedge funds these days are scraping social media data like the one over here to try to find quick response of public opinion about new products that get online. On the right, you're looking at these kind of wearable devices that perhaps record some kind of data that can be relatable to health habits and maybe used for insurance. In fact, I just found out that one of the products that was launched by 众安保险 almost 10 years ago called the 步步宝 that was exactly trying to kind of reward people who are walking a lot by giving them discount on insurance. So as we kind of embrace this type of alternative data, we do have to kind of slow down a little bit and think about the next question, which is, where's our data coming from? Right? So if I had this video working, you will basically see a phone model that's kind of wobbling back and forth this phone to create a fake step count. Right? That's what this supposedly this video is trying to create. So if you're looking about companies or our algorithms trying to leverage this alternative data to predict something that supposedly was working in past training data, and then you see people respond to that by doing this, we really start worrying whether out of sample this model is going to have any power in predicting things anymore. That's kind of the first motivation. And if you worry about, or if you wonder whether this kind of adversarial behavior has any bite on our state-of-the-art models or not, the answer is definitively yes. In fact, I think Professor Jiang, he mentioned this exact example. This is actually one of the papers that's pretty well known in the machine learning literature called one pixel attack. So if you take these pictures on the right over here, all you have to do is just alter 1 pixel, right? This is basically your budget constraint. If you change 1 pixel in this picture, you can basically throw those state-of-the-art convolutional neural networks on their heels. They get completely the wrong classification and result. That just shows kind of fundamentally these very powerful machine learning models appear to be very fragile to these adversarial attacks when people change the data in a deliberate way. And then just one last kind of a slide for motivation. If you wonder whether people are doing this for real commercial purposes, just look at the Google search results, right? If you look for tricks to improve your credit score, look at how many results you get. You can see that there's plenty of these attempts and also kind of well-organized knowledge to try to think about strategically how you manipulate the data. So that's kind of one side, using alternative data as a motivation for thinking about information manipulation. Another example I think that's also important is in the setting of impact investing. In particular, think about green investing. Right? So we know that impact investing has been viewed as an essential tool for achieving some of the key climate and environmental goals, such as in China, the carbon peak and carbon neutrality. But if you pause for a second and think about who are the green investors, we like to think about investors who have truly green preferences. Right? These are people who truly care about being green. But actually, more of the people who are actually participating in the market and owning more of the assets are so-called dedicated asset managers. They don't necessarily care about greenness themselves, but rather they face this mandate. Right? Basically, they were constrained by some kind of a contract or some kind of agreement that they need to invest in assets that are rated highly based on some kind of ESG scores. Now, where do these ESG scores come from? They come from third-party rating agencies. Right? So they kind of put a stamp of approval these are the assets that are green, the other assets are brown. You need to hold enough of these green assets to satisfy your mandate. All right. Now, due to a lack of kind of standardization and the verification, these kind of a green data, or kind of, let's say, carbon emission data, actually are, fields that have perfect opportunities for firms and the parties involved to manipulate, right? And in fact, it's actually not so easy to catch this kind of manipulation. And then, as a result of that, if you think about all the parties involved, that involves, for example, the firms here that are doing the emission, the asset managers who, remember, only care about the scores, and then the rating agencies who are trying to sell their scores. We're going to try to show you that in certain settings, all three parties are going to have incentives to engage in something called greenwashing, which is basically a way of inflating their greenness, generating this kind of a biased representation of their true behavior. Okay? So basically the research question we want to think about, if we want to kind of frame it generally, is in financial markets in particular, how would we think about the impact of information manipulation on the equilibrium, right? So in particular, we want to understand how these three parties I mentioned earlier, firms, investors, rating agencies should interact or would interact when information is actually manipulable. Specifically, we are interested in thinking about price efficiency. We're also thinking about allocative efficiency, right? So price efficiency basically means, if you think about price efficiency, for example, in the ESG setting, impact investing's whole goal is to try to align, right, the greenness with the cost of capital. The greener firms would like to reduce their cost of capital. Lower price efficiency in our setting basically means that alignment is not going to be achieved because of the manipulation. The second thing is about allocative efficiency, which has to do with the fact that those people who care about getting green or want to achieve the impact investing goals hopefully would end up with a portfolio that's greener than others. Is that true or not? Well, that's going to be affected by this manipulation as well. Right? So these are the two things we're going to try to analyze. And as a financial economist, the only way I know how to analyze this logically in a logically consistent way is by building a model. So that's where I'm going to try to spend the remaining of the time talking about. So let me first kind of overview what results we got from the model. Right? We're going to look at the investors in two kind of different categories. One is thinking about investors who are more kind of benign. These are the truly green investors. Right? These are the people who want to do good, who really want to solve this climate change problem by altering their investment behavior. In that world, if we live in that world, here are a few things that would happen. Perhaps it will be surprising, maybe not so much. The first thing that might seem a little bit counterintuitive is that the average degree of manipulability of the signals doesn't actually end up mattering, as long as it's publicly knowable to the investors. Why? For the simple reason that if you know the average tendency that the firms are going to manipulate, you can just undo that manipulation yourself, right? So in a rational expectation kind of a framework, these kind of average biases can be easily corrected. So that's not a problem. The problem actually resides in this uncertainty about manipulability. So in particular, in our model, it speaks about the fact that the different firms might have different degrees of costs that they pay to manipulate their scores. Right? Some firms might have the technology that are more conducive to altering their carbon emission. Other firms might just have a lower kind of moral standards and they just be more willing to do that. All these could be reasons why these firms do more of this manipulation and other firms do less. That is something, however, the public investors don't know about. And this kind of uncertainty in the cross-section is going to generate this uncertainty. And that's going to add a lot of noise in the data. Right? That's what causes this efficiency, price efficiency in particular, to go down. And in order to truly analyze that, however, you need to really solve the whole equilibrium because it really depends on endogenously the firm's incentive to manipulate. And that endogenous incentive to manipulate depends on how sensitive the prices are to these scores in the first place. These are going to become clear in a second, I hope. And then the third thing is that the result is that the effectiveness of the impact investing can actually decline as we increase the share of the investors that are green investors. So this is perhaps the most surprising result so far. And intuitively, it has to do with the fact that when you increase the share of investors who care about greenness, that's going to generate more incentives for firms to manipulate. So as a result, uncertainty about manipulation is going to endogenously get amplified. And that ultimately is what caused the price efficiency to go down. And then finally, this is kind of a tangential kind of implication about optimal design of learning. We know that in a statistical learning sense, we typically want to kind of minimize something such as the mean squared error out of sample, right? To try to find the most informative signals to predict the most, generate the most precise prediction. Now that you realize that these signals can be manipulated, the consideration becomes different. You have to somehow anticipate what signals can be manipulated more and generates more noise as a result, and other signals less. So one signal that was, in a statistical sense, most precise may not be something that you should want to use too heavily if it's also easy to manipulate, right? So that's kind of the trade-off that a kind of algorithm designer has to consider. And that is not a purely statistical problem anymore. In fact, this is where exactly can bring in a ton of economics and makes the learning problem really interesting. All right, and then the second part of the paper we kind of analyze is, now let's imagine that investors don't behave like the ones who truly care about greenness. There are now these kind of dedicated asset managers who are investing in green assets only because they're told to do so. And in fact, they're doing so by following these scores provided by third parties. In that setting, two things happen. Number one, this average degree of manipulation matters. Why? Because if you have a signal that is easy to manipulate, right, and the rating agencies kind of tolerate that. In fact, they more than tolerate that, they encourage that. What's going to happen is that there's going to be great rating inflation, right? A brown asset could even be rated as green. Now, why is that good for the parties involved? Well, it's good for the asset managers because that effectively relaxes this constraint they're facing. Right? Remember, previously, this dedicated asset manager only invest in green assets because they're told to invest in basket of assets that have sufficiently high average scores. Now that because the scores are inflated, it is as if their investment constraints being relaxed. So that's the one thing why asset managers like it. Why would the rating agencies be in the cahoot about this? Well, because the rating agents are trying to sell their scores. If the asset managers like it, they're going to buy the scores of the most inflated. So that's kind of the market force that's going to push the rating agencies to want to inflate their ratings too. Right? So in this case, you see that truly three parties involved are all going to be in the same boat of trying to inflate the score. And that's perhaps the most undesirable outcome. And then one last thing is that, like I mentioned, in that case, if you push too strongly on this investment mandate, let's say that you are the kind of asset owner, you are the investor, who are delegating your assets to the money managers. You want to truly own green assets, and you sign this very strong, like strict mandate on the part of this delegated asset manager. Well, our model shows that if you push too hard on that, you're going to end up with actually worse worse portfolio allocations rather than the ones you wanted. Okay? I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to go through the whole model with the time I have remaining, but I do want to kind of just very briefly sketch out what the model ingredients look like. Right? So basically, this is a kind of a static model with noisy rational expectation. Like I mentioned, there are three parties involved. There's a seller of the information called the rating agency. There's a firm, and there's a group of investors. There's a stock, and there's a bond. Okay? So in particular for the stock, we're going to model two attributes. So one attribute is what we call cash flows. Right? So these are the cash flows that everybody should care about, whether you're a green investor or not. And then there's another attribute which we can call greenness, right? So this is something that only one type of investors in this economy care about. These are the kind of the impact investors. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about what is the objective of each one of them, right? So information seller obviously wants to sell their scores, or in this case, can sell their data or process data, let's say, and try to maximize their profit. So we are thinking about information seller as a monopolistic information seller here. What the information seller is going to try to do is that they're going to try to sell signals that generates most revenue, right, for them. So they need to decide what is the price to sell. If there are multiple signals they can use to package as one score, then there's an algorithm design problem in there too. And we're going to think about only the simple case of a linear algorithms. In that case, you just need to choose what is the optimal weight you assign to different signals. So in that setting, as I can explain earlier, this consideration about whether you want to choose the most informative signal ignoring manipulation, or you want to endogenously take into account manipulation, becomes a serious trade-off. So that's the information seller. And then there's investor. Investment problem is probably pretty simple. They want to maximize the expected utility of investing. The only difference is that there's a group of regular investors who don't care about greenness, and there's another group of investors who actually care about greenness. That's why there's G tilde that shows up in their utility function. And then finally, there's the firm. The firm tries to maximize the stock price. Right? So this is basically the typical objective, except that they have the ability to manipulate the scores, and they're going to incur some kind of a quadratic cost for that. Okay? And by the way, in our setting, of course, maximizing the price is the same thing as minimizing the cost of capital. All right, so this is basically the timeline, and I probably already kind of sketched out most of this already. So basically, the way this game is going to be played is that the information seller announces the scoring algorithm, which is going to be completely transparent to the outside world. Firms are going to correspondingly manipulate their signals at some costs. Right? If there are multiple signals, they could choose to simultaneously alternate multiple signals here. The investors will decide whether to buy the score provided rating agencies or not. If they do buy the score, they will get the signal, the score that's packaged from these signals provided by the firm, may be manipulated. And then finally, the investor will submit the demand for the stock, and the market will clear, and then the next day, this is when everything will be realized. Okay. Let me fast forward. So let me just show you what the equilibrium looks like. Right? So in particular, let me point your attention to this picture over here on the third panel. This is basically showing you as you change theta, which is the share of impact investors or green investors in our economy. You can see that relative to the case without manipulation, which is the blue dotted line, this correlation between the price and the true greenness, which is basically a measure of price efficiency, eventually dips down. Right? So this is basically what I mentioned earlier. If you have enough of these green investors out there, the firms have such strong incentive to manipulate that the noise coming from manipulations are so high, it actually drives down the price efficiency. So this is kind of one result I want to emphasize. The second result is this learning algorithm. So in a multiple signal setting, what would happen if you are abiding by the standard statistical learning rule? What you want to do is basically minimize the noise coming from the score. Right? So this is basically the blue part. I want to minimize the sum of the variance coming from the true signal and the additional noise. You basically find a combination of the weights such that you minimize the additional noise provided the signals. That's what like a basic linear regression would ask you to do. And then here's the part that was new, coming from manipulation. Right? So I mentioned to you earlier, average degree manipulability doesn't matter, but what matters is this notion of the uncertainty about manipulation. Yes. So, but you can see, I deliberately left this really ugly formula here for you to see, because this is basically showing you it is really endogenous. It depends on the entire economy structure, in particular, the composition of different investors, their preferences, and so on and so forth. All of this endogenous determines how sensitive, right, this uncertainty manipulation really is. And that is something that is completely outside of the typical statistical learning considerations. And this is where I think for those of you, especially if it's your students out there, I think there is a lot the economics can contribute to making this kind of learning algorithm more efficient. But if you consider this kind of a manipulation incentive on the part of the agents. By the way, this is actually the literature in the computer science, right? So people in computer science think about this robust machine learning, typically modeled as something called a Stackelberg game, it's a leader-follower game. But in those settings, typically the agents are modeled in rather reduced form. So in this case, of course, we are thinking about it's going to be equilibrium feedback in a more serious manner. Okay, so one final thing I want to mention is this mandate model. As I did mention that there's an alternative case, which is what happens when investors don't care about greenness, they only care about the score. The simple way for our model to capture that is by changing the preference of those green investors such that they don't care about G tilde anymore, but now they care about the score. Okay? You can think of this as a reduced form to capture the constraint they face. If you put a constraint on their portfolio holding, this is almost like a Lagrange multiplier showing up over here. So what happens in this case is that number one, the average greenness of the mandate investor portfolio holding would actually first increase and then decrease if the strength of the mandate as captured by this beta parameter in the preference becomes bigger and bigger. And then the second thing is exactly this grading inflation, right? So perhaps not surprisingly, now that you see how the model works, because really in this setting, these mandate investors don't care about the scores being accurate predictors of G tilde anymore. There's really no disciplining role, or I could say, much weaker disciplining role they play in steering the rating agency to provide accurate scores. In fact, rating agencies have no incentive to do that. They inflate the scores such that the score becomes more popular among these rating agencies, among these investors. So let me summarize because I'm already out of time. I should mention very quickly at the end is that you might be wondering maybe introducing more competition among rating agencies would help. The answer is not really, especially in the case with mandate investors. In fact, introducing more competition among the rating agencies makes things even worse. There's going to be even more rating inflation. So let me summarize. Right? The implications I think I would like to convey here is that number one, in some settings, as we study over here, really it seems like all private participants in this information market have the incentive to manipulate. That's something that you should be really worried about. That means that the private market solutions are not going to solve this problem. So as a result, we should be thinking about potentially different ways to keep this kind of manipulation information in check, such as regulator-imposed disclosure standards or maybe third-party monitors of the rating agents themselves. It's also kind of interesting that there seems to be a lot of room to bring economics into the machine learning literature, in particular thinking about the modeling those strategic incentives of the parties that are generating the data. And for this, I think economics has a lot to contribute. Sorry for running out of time, but this is what I have to say.